At 3:07 a.m., the forest stopped making noise, not slowly, not naturally. It cut off like someone had flipped a switch. The soldier woke instantly, heart racing, hand already moving toward the rifle that wasn't there. For a split second, he didn't know where he was. The canvas ceiling above him looked wrong, too low, too close. Then the smell hit him. Wet soil, pine sap, cold metal, and memory snapped back into place. Training exercise, remote trail, northern wilderness, no civilians. No lights, no towns for miles. And yet something was glowing outside his tent, not flickering, not wavering, a steady, pulsing light, blue-white, hovering just beyond the tree line. He held his breath and listened. Nothing, no insects, no wind, no distant engines, not even the soft movement of other soldiers in their tents. He was alone. That wasn't possible. There were 12 men assigned to this perimeter. 12 trained professionals who slept lightly and reacted fast. If someone had turned on a light out there would have been shouting already, radios crackling, boots hitting dirt. There was none of that. The light pulsed again, closer this time. His first thought wasn't UFO, it wasn't ghost, it was worse. This is not on the exercise plan. He unzipped the tent slowly, every sense stretched tight, and that's when he saw it clearly for the first time. The light wasn't attached to anything, no vehicle, no flare, no drone hum. It hovered between the trees, perfectly still, as if waiting, and deep in his chest, beneath training and logic and years of discipline, something older and more primitive whispered a single warning. If you follow it, you will not come back the same. Still, he stepped outside, because soldiers are trained to move toward the unknown. And whatever that light was, it already knew his name. What happened on that remote trail was never meant to be part of any official report. No medals were awarded, no commendations issued, no explanations offered, only a transfer request filed 3 weeks later, and a soldier who stopped sleeping in the dark. This story comes from declassified fragments, first-hand testimony, and a trail exercise that quietly vanished from public records. The location was officially described as routine. The disappearance of several hours of log data was described as equipment malfunction. But equipment doesn't malfunction in patterns. And soldiers don't request reassignment because of nothing. Tonight's story isn't about what people want to believe, whether it was a UFO, a ghost, or something else entirely. It's about what one trained observer experienced when all familiar rules stopped applying at once. As you listen, remember, this was not a civilian, not someone prone to imagination or panic. This was a man trained to identify threats, track movement, and remain grounded under pressure. And yet, after that night, he would admit one thing he had never said out loud before. Whatever he followed at 3 a.m. was not trying to scare him. It was trying to lead him. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe if you're drawn to stories like this. True accounts where reality bends quietly, and the most unsettling moments are the ones that leave no clear answers. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. A city apartment, a rural road, or somewhere quiet where the dark feels closer than it should. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the trail, to the silence, and to the exact moment the light appeared. The training zone sat deep inside federally restricted land, the kind of place that didn't appear on civilian maps and didn't invite curiosity. Even among soldiers, assignments like this were considered forgettable. Long hours, cold ground, nothing to see but trees and dirt. That was the point. The unit had arrived before sunset, boots crunching over gravel as trucks pulled away and left them alone with the forest. Radios were checked, perimeters marked, tents spaced according to protocol. Everything normal. The soldier, I'll call him Mason, had walked the trail twice before nightfall. Once with the team, once alone. He memorized landmarks the way he always did. A split pine near the bend, a shallow creek 20 yards off the path, a boulder shaped like a collapsed wall. Nothing unusual, no lights, no sounds beyond nature, no feeling of being watched. By 2200 hours, the temperature dropped sharply. The forest grew dense with shadow, moonlight barely filtering through the canopy. Mason settled into his tent fully dressed, boots within reach, weapons stored according to exercise rules. Sleep came fast. Too fast. That was the first detail that bothered him later. Soldiers don't usually fall into deep sleep that quickly in unfamiliar terrain. Your body stays alert, half awake, tuned for disruption. But Mason slept hard. No dreams, no gradual descent, just black. The wake-up was violent, not from noise but from absence. He opened his eyes into silence so complete it felt artificial. The kind of quiet that presses inward, making you aware of your own breathing as a violation. His watch glowed faintly. 03:07. He reached instinctively for the radio. Dead. No static. No hiss. Just nothing. That alone raised his pulse. Military radios don't fail silently. Batteries drain with warning. Connections crackle before dying. This was different, as if the device had been switched off remotely. Then the light appeared. At first, it filtered through the tent fabric as a soft glow, like moonlight intensified. But the color was wrong. Too blue. Too sharp. It didn't diffuse naturally. It defined edges. Mason froze. Training tells you not to rush unknown stimuli. Observe first. Identify. Assess. He held still, counting his breaths, watching as the glow brightened and dimmed in a slow rhythm. 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off. That pattern felt intentional. He unzipped the tent an inch. Cold air rushed in, carrying no scent of smoke, fuel, or ozone. Just damp earth. Outside, the camp was empty. Not quiet. Empty. Tents stood where they should have been, but unoccupied. Flaps open, gear untouched, no footprints in the dirt leading away. It was as if the entire unit had evaporated. His first rational explanation was relocation, emergency extraction, some drill he hadn't been briefed on, except drills leave signs, tracks, radio chatter, command markers. There were none. The light pulsed again, now clearly visible between the trees, about 50 yards down the trail. It hovered just above ground level, perfectly centered on the path Mason had walked earlier, not swaying, not drifting, waiting. He stepped out of the tent, boots sinking slightly into the cold soil. The moment his foot touched ground, the light intensified, as if acknowledging him. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, recognition. He checked his compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. That was when a thought crossed his mind, unwelcome and sharp. Whatever this is, it doesn't want witnesses. The light began to move, slowly, down the trail, away from camp, and without fully deciding to, Mason followed. The moment Mason stepped fully onto the trail, the forest seemed to accept his decision, not approve of it, not resist it, simply adjust. The light moved ahead at a steady pace, never fast enough to chase, never slow enough to ignore. It remained just far enough to require commitment. Every time Mason slowed, it slowed. When he stopped, it stopped. Control without force. He kept his breathing measured, posture loose, senses open. Training still governed his movements, even as logic struggled to keep up. He scanned the tree line constantly, expecting, almost hoping, for something tangible to explain the situation. A vehicle, a flare suspended by a wire, a drone, advanced but flawed. There was nothing, no hum, no wind displacement, no shadow cast in the wrong direction. The trail curved gently uphill, narrowing as it climbed. The further Mason walked, the more familiar landmarks disappeared. He should have reached the creek by now, the boulder shaped like a collapsed wall. They were gone. The forest had rearranged itself, not dramatically. No walls of trees closing in, no sudden cliffs, just subtle shifts. A bend where none existed before. A slope that felt longer than it should have been. He checked his watch again. 03:11. 4 minutes. It felt like 20. The radio on his chest crackled once, just a burst of static so sharp it made him flinch, then went dead again. He raised it instinctively, thumb hovering over the transmit button. "Mason to perimeter," he said quietly. "Do you copy?" Silence answered, but not emptiness. The quiet here felt occupied. The light slowed as the trail leveled out into a narrow clearing Mason had never seen. The trees pulled back just enough to form a circular space, ground flattened unnaturally smooth. No leaves, no rocks, no debris, as if something had pressed the earth down and kept it that way. The light hovered at the center of the clearing now, brighter than before, its color shifting subtly, blue to white to something closer to silver. Mason felt a pressure behind his eyes, faint but persistent, like standing too close to heavy machinery. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. Every instinct told him this was the boundary. Crossing it would matter. The light pulsed once, longer this time. Invitation. His mouth was dry. He swallowed and felt the movement echo strangely inside his head, as if the sensation lagged by half a second. He lifted his hand toward the light, not touching it, just testing proximity. The air around it felt thicker, not warmer, not colder, dense. The pressure behind his eyes increased. Images flashed, not visions, not hallucinations. More like impressions, fragments without context, a map he didn't recognize, symbols etched into stone, a sensation of falling upward. He pulled his hand back sharply. His heart hammered now, but his body still moved with control. He wasn't panicking. He was reacting to stimuli his training had never accounted for. "Mason," he whispered to himself. "Grounding technique. Name yourself. Stay present." The light dimmed slightly, as if responding to his withdrawal. Then something changed. From the far edge of the clearing, movement rippled through the trees, not approaching, not retreating, adjusting, like something shifting its weight just out of view. Mason turned slowly, scanning. "Show yourself," he said, voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. Nothing stepped forward, but the sensation intensified, the feeling of being observed not by eyes, but by attention. The light pulsed again. This time Mason felt it not just in front of him, but behind his eyes, behind his thoughts. A gentle pressure, testing, like fingers brushing against a sealed door. Then came the sound. Not external, internal. A low tone, almost imperceptible, vibrating through his chest rather than his ears. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't language. It was alignment. The clearing brightened suddenly, the light expanding outward, bathing the trees in sharp, colorless illumination. Shadows vanished entirely. Depth flattened. For a split second, Mason felt weightless. The ground beneath his boots felt distant, his vision tunneled, and then darkness, not loss of consciousness. Transition. When sensation returned, the forest was wrong. The trees were still there, but their spacing felt altered, geometry subtly distorted. The trail behind him was gone entirely, replaced by uneven ground that sloped away in a direction that made no sense. The light hovered close now, no more than 10 feet away. Mason turned slowly, taking stock. His watch read 0309. Time had moved backward. That realization hit harder than anything else. Equipment fails. Perception warps. Fear exaggerates. But time does not reverse casually. His radio crackled again, louder this time. "Mason?" A voice, familiar, distorted. "Where the hell are you?" He nearly collapsed with relief. "I'm on the trail," he said quickly. "I followed a—" He stopped. "How do you explain this?" "A light," he finished. Silence stretched. Then, "That's not funny." "I'm not joking," Mason said. "Where is everyone?" Another pause. "We've been calling you for 20 minutes, the voice said. "You never checked in after rotation." Mason's stomach dropped. "That's impossible," he said. "I woke up 4 minutes ago." "No," the voice replied. "You've been off-grid since 0245. 22 minutes. Gone." Mason looked back at the clearing. It was gone. Trees stood where it had been, leaves undisturbed, the ground uneven again, no sign of compression, no light, just darkness and cold. "I need you to mark your position," the voice said urgently. "Now!" Mason checked his GPS. Error. Compass spinning again. "I can't," he said. "I don't know where I am." The radio crackled violently, then cut out completely. Dead. Again. And deep in his chest, that low vibration returned. Fainter now, but unmistakable. The light was gone. But whatever had led him there hadn't left. It had simply stepped back, waiting. Mason did not move for several seconds after the radio went dead. He stood exactly where he was, knees slightly bent, weight balanced, eyes scanning the darkness the way he'd been trained to since his first year in uniform. Panic wastes energy. Freezing wastes time. What mattered now was orientation, and orientation was gone. The forest around him felt familiar in pieces, but wrong as a whole. Trees stood where trees should stand, yet the spacing between them felt inconsistent, as if the terrain had been copied imperfectly. The slope of the ground angled subtly in ways that didn't match his memory of the trail. Even the air felt altered, heavier, resistant, like it pushed back when he inhaled. He checked his watch again. 03:10. Seconds were moving forward now. Normally. That unsettled him more than if time had continued behaving strangely. A glitch that corrects itself is harder to explain than one that persists. Mason forced himself to kneel and touch the ground. Cold, damp, real. He rubbed soil between his fingers, grounding himself in sensation. No numbness, no dissociation. His body was responding normally, which meant whatever had happened wasn't happening to his mind. It had happened around him. He stood and chose a direction, not based on logic, but on instinct refined by years of patrols. You don't always know where you are, but you can often tell where you shouldn't be. The forest to his left felt closed, heavy, oppressive. The right felt open, less resistant. He moved right. Each step felt measured, as if the ground itself were listening. He avoided breaking branches, avoided sudden movement, operating under the quiet assumption that stealth still mattered, even if he didn't know who or what might be watching. After roughly 5 minutes of walking, something changed. Sound returned, first faintly, a rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of an insect, then more fully. The forest exhaled, and with it came the familiar noise of nightlife resuming. Mason stopped. This was important. The silence earlier hadn't been natural. It had been imposed. Now it was lifting. Relief washed through him in a controlled wave. If the forest could sound normal again, then normal rules might still apply. That meant navigation. That meant recovery. He increased his pace slightly, careful not to run. Soldiers who run without a clear threat burn credibility with themselves. He focused on identifying landmarks, anything consistent. Then he saw it. A glow. Not ahead, behind. He turned slowly. Between the trees, far back along the path he'd just taken, the same blue-white light hovered, dim this time, partially obscured by branches. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It observed. Mason felt the low vibration again, subtle but present, like a bass note beneath the world. His vision sharpened unnaturally, edges crisp, colors slightly exaggerated. It's tracking me, he thought. Not hunting, tracking. He forced himself not to react. Predators respond to attention. He kept walking, eyes forward, posture calm. Every instinct screamed to run, but he resisted. After another minute, the glow faded, dissolving into darkness without movement. No drift, no descent. It simply ceased to be. Mason exhaled slowly. That was when he heard voices, human voices, low, urgent, familiar. Check the south line again. Negative, he's not here. Relief surged harder this time, nearly knocking him off balance. He raised his arm and shouted, "Here! I'm here!" Flashlights snapped on instantly, beams cutting through the trees. Two figures emerged at a jog, rifles slung, faces tight with concern. "Mason?" one of them said. Jesus Christ! They grabbed his shoulders, checking him instinctively for injuries. "Where the hell did you go?" the other asked. "We thought you'd been taken." "Taken by what?" Mason asked. They exchanged a look. "You tell us," the first soldier said. "You vanished." They guided him back toward the main trail, and this time the landmarks returned. Split pine, shallow creek, the boulder shaped like a collapsed wall. Everything where it should have been. Normal. Too normal. At camp, the rest of the unit stood clustered around the command tent. Relief mixed with something else, unease. No one joked. No one made light of it. The officer in charge pulled Mason aside immediately. "You were off comms for 22 minutes, he said. "GPS dropped. Compass readings went haywire across the grid. We almost called for extraction." Mason nodded slowly. "I followed a light." The officer's jaw tightened. "Describe it," Mason did, carefully, precisely, avoiding speculation. He spoke in observations, not conclusions. Color, movement, distance, time discrepancies. When he finished, the officer said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he said, "You're not the first to report something like that." Mason looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" The officer glanced around, lowered his voice. "Different locations, different exercises, same pattern. Light appears. Silence." "Lost time. Why wasn't this briefed?" Mason asked. "Because it's not acknowledged," the officer replied, "and because most people don't follow it." Mason swallowed. "So, what was it?" The officer met his eyes. "Officially, nothing. Unofficially," he added, "something that doesn't like being seen and doesn't like witnesses who resist." That night, Mason didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the vibration return, faint but insistent, like a signal pulsing from somewhere just beyond perception. The light had not harmed him. It had tested him, And whatever it was, it now knew something important, that Mason could see it, and that he had followed. Sleep never truly came. Mason lay on his back inside the tent, eyes open, listening to the forest breathe. The sounds were normal again. Wind through branches, distant insects, the occasional shift of another soldier turning in their sleep. Yet none of it felt reassuring. Normal had become suspicious. Every few minutes he checked his watch. Time moved correctly now. Seconds ticked forward with mechanical indifference. That should have comforted him. It didn't. Because whatever had taken those missing minutes had returned them imperfectly, like a borrowed object set back in place, with a faint scratch no one else could see. Around 0420, he felt it again. Not the light, the pressure. A subtle tightening behind the eyes, accompanied by a barely perceptible hum beneath the world's noise. It wasn't loud enough to hear, only enough to feel, like standing near a power station where the air itself vibrates. Mason sat up slowly. The camp looked unchanged. Tents stood evenly spaced. Gear rested where it had been left. Two perimeter guards shifted positions quietly, unaware of anything unusual. And yet, Mason knew with complete certainty that something was wrong. He stepped out of the tent and walked toward the edge of camp, careful not to draw attention. His boots pressed into the soil, leaving clear prints. He noticed that detail immediately. Earlier, there had been no tracks. Now there were. That mattered. At the tree line, he stopped. The forest stared back, opaque and dense, offering nothing. No glow, no movement, no invitation. But the sensation remained. It's not gone, he thought. It's just not visible. The training exercise ended early the next morning. Officially, the reason given was equipment interference, communications anomalies. A decision made out of caution. No one objected. No one asked for details. That silence, too, felt rehearsed. During debrief, Mason was pulled aside again. This time not by his commanding officer, but by a man he hadn't seen before. Older, civilian clothes, no insignia. His presence alone signaled that something had crossed into a different category. "I'm going to ask you questions," the man said calmly. "I need you to answer them exactly as you remember, not how you think they should sound." Mason nodded. "Did the light move with intention?" "Yes." "Did it respond to your movement?" "Yes." "Did you feel threatened?" Mason paused. This one required honesty. "No." The man studied him. "Did you feel guided?" Mason hesitated longer this time. "Yes." The man made a small note on his pad. "Did it communicate?" "No voices," Mason said. "But it impressed things. Images, sensations." "Like suggestions?" "Like alignment," Mason replied, surprising himself with the word. like it was checking if I could follow. The man closed the notebook. "That's all for now." "For now?" Mason asked. The man met his eyes. "You didn't panic. You didn't flee. You didn't resist. That puts you in a very small category." "What category is that?" "One we monitor," the man said. Then he turned and walked away. Back at base days later, the incident was never mentioned again. Reports were sanitized. The missing time logged as temporary signal interference. Mason's name appeared nowhere unusual. On paper, nothing had happened. But Mason noticed changes. His sleep patterns shifted. He woke seconds before alarms. He sensed movement before it occurred. During training drills, he reacted faster, not by thinking but by anticipating, as if part of him was slightly ahead of the present moment. He began to notice lights where others didn't, brief flashes at the edge of vision. Reflections that lingered too long. Once, during night watch weeks later, he saw a faint glow far beyond the perimeter fence, gone the moment he focused on it. He reported nothing. He remembered the officer's words. Most people don't follow it, and those who did were noticed. One evening, nearly a month later, Mason received a message routed through channels that didn't exist on official systems. No sender, no return path, just coordinates and a time. Othrisu. He stared at the screen for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to delete it, to pretend the forest had been nothing more than a malfunction layered with fear. But deep down, beneath discipline and logic, something else stirred. Recognition. This wasn't a summons. It was confirmation. The light hadn't been random. The silence hadn't been environmental. The lost time hadn't been accidental. It had been a test, and now someone or something was checking the results. Mason powered down the device and sat alone in the dim barracks, the hum faint but unmistakable beneath the walls. Whatever he had followed at 3 a.m. on that remote trail hadn't disappeared. It had simply stepped back long enough to see if he would notice the invitation when it returned. And the most unsettling part wasn't the possibility of UFOs or ghosts. It was the growing realization that the light didn't belong to the forest at all. It belonged to the space just beyond human awareness, and it was learning who could see it. The coordinates led to a place Mason recognized immediately, not because he had been there before, but because it wasn't supposed to exist. The location pointed to a stretch of land officially classified as unremarkable terrain. No installations, no trails, no scheduled exercises. A blank space on every map that mattered. Those were always the places worth paying attention to. Mason arrived 2 nights later, just before 02:30. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. He hadn't requested authorization. He had learned instinctively that this wasn't something to bring into formal channels. The road ended abruptly, dissolving into gravel and then dirt. He parked and continued on foot, following a faint path that felt less like something carved by use and more like something allowed to exist. The forest here was different, not darker, not thicker. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Mason checked his watch. The seconds ticked forward, but something about them felt stretched, as if time here required more effort to move. At exactly 02:59, the hum began. Low, subtle, familiar. It resonated in his chest before it reached his ears. The same vibration he'd felt on the trail weeks earlier. His breathing slowed automatically. His body recognized the signal before his mind caught up. At 03:00, the light appeared. This time, it didn't hover at a distance. It manifested directly ahead of him, less than 20 feet away, emerging not from the forest, but within it, like a layer being peeled back to reveal something underneath. The light was brighter now, more defined, its edges sharpened and softened in slow cycles, pulsing with a rhythm that felt deliberate. Mason noticed something new immediately. It cast no shadow, not on the ground, not on the trees, not on him. The absence felt intentional. He didn't move, neither did the light. Minutes passed, then something changed, not externally but internally. Mason felt a sensation of pressure at the base of his skull, gentle but insistent, as if attention were being focused there. Images surfaced again, not memories, not dreams, locations, patterns, shapes that felt mathematical rather than symbolic, a sense of distance collapsing inward, of separation becoming irrelevant. The forest around him faded, not disappearing but becoming secondary, like background noise to a signal finally tuned correctly. A realization struck him with sudden clarity. This wasn't contact. It was calibration. The light wasn't studying him as an individual. It was measuring compatibility, response, capacity. His heart rate remained steady. That seemed to matter. The hum deepened slightly. Then, for the first time, something new occurred. The light shifted position, not forward or back, but sideways, sliding through space without crossing the distance between points. Mason felt his stomach drop as his perception struggled to follow the movement. Space bent, not visually, experientially. The forest no longer felt continuous, it felt layered. The light pulsed once, longer than before, and Mason understood without being told that this was the moment he could choose to disengage, not run, not resist, simply refuse to proceed. That option existed. The realization terrified him more than the alternative, because if there was a choice, then whatever was happening wasn't accidental. Mason stepped forward. The hum intensified instantly, vibrating through his bones, his teeth, the air itself. The forest blurred at the edges, depth collapsing into flat plains. His vision narrowed, not from fear, but from focus. The light expanded. For a brief moment, Mason felt weightless again, not falling, not rising, but unanchored. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it carried with it an overwhelming impression. This is not a place. It is a state. When the sensation receded, Mason found himself standing in the same spot. The forest returned. The light dimmed slightly, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer being observed. He was being acknowledged. The pressure behind his eyes eased, replaced by a strange clarity. His thoughts felt quieter, less cluttered. The low hum remained, but now it felt like a baseline rather than an intrusion. Then came the final impression. Not an image, not a voice, a concept. You can return, not now, not immediately, but eventually. The light contracted, folding inward until it vanished without trace. The forest resumed its natural sounds in a slow wave, insects restarting one by one. Mason stood alone again, but the loneliness felt different. It wasn't absence, it was distance. He checked his watch. 0301. 1 minute had passed, yet his body felt as if hours had been compressed into that space. As he turned back toward his vehicle, Mason understood something that would haunt him long after this night. The phenomenon on the trail hadn't been random, the lost time hadn't been an error, and the invitation hadn't been unique. This was happening to others. Quietly, selectively, and whatever intelligence governed the light was not interested in belief. It was interested in capability. The question wasn't whether it was a UFO or a ghost. The question was far more unsettling. Why were only certain people able to follow it? And what happened to those who couldn't? Mason didn't report the second encounter, not because he feared disbelief, but because he understood, with a clarity that felt almost imposed, that reporting it would change the nature of what had happened. The first encounter had been an anomaly. The second had been confirmation. Confirmation invites oversight. Oversight invites interference, and whatever intelligence governed the light had made one thing clear: this process functioned best without noise. In the days that followed, Mason noticed subtle alterations in himself that no medical exam would flag, but no trained operator could ignore. His reaction times shortened by fractions of a second. His situational awareness sharpened, not by effort, but by instinct. He began to anticipate movement, footsteps before they echoed, shifts in posture before they occurred. It wasn't enhancement, it was alignment. The world felt slightly ahead of itself, and Mason felt slightly ahead of the world. During drills, instructors started watching him differently, not impressed, curious, as if they were trying to identify what variable had changed. Mason stayed careful. He avoided excelling too visibly. Performance spikes attract attention, and attention creates records. Records were dangerous now. At night, the hum returned occasionally, never loud, never urgent. A background resonance that reminded him the connection hadn't closed. It had stabilized. Then came the dreams. They weren't symbolic. There were no monsters, no lights, no forests. Instead, Mason dreamed of movement through space that felt non-linear. Not flying, not teleporting, sliding. He would wake with his heart steady, breath calm, mind unusually clear. The dreams left no emotional residue, only information impressions he couldn't articulate but somehow retained. One morning he woke with a sentence in his mind that hadn't been there before. You were not selected. You were compatible. The difference mattered. Weeks passed, then months. And just when Mason began to believe the encounters had concluded, the third signal arrived. Not as coordinates, but as absence. During a routine night exercise at a different location, Mason noticed something wrong almost immediately. The forest went quiet again. Not entirely, not suddenly, selectively. Insects stopped first, then wind, then distant ambient noise. But this time, Mason didn't freeze. He observed. He watched his teammates continue moving, unaware. Radios worked, equipment functioned. The world, for everyone else, remained intact. Only Mason felt the pressure. Only Mason sensed the narrowing. That was when he understood something unsettling. The phenomenon no longer needed to isolate everyone. It only needed to isolate him. The light appeared at the edge of the tree line, dimmer than before, but unmistakable. This time, it didn't lead away. It paralleled him. Mason continued walking, posture relaxed, breathing steady. The light matched his pace, maintaining a consistent distance, testing again. He glanced at his watch. 02:58. He did not stop. He did not follow. He acknowledged its presence without submission. The hum intensified briefly, then stabilized. The pressure behind his eyes returned, but weaker now, less invasive. Approval, not because he followed, but because he chose not to. The realization struck hard. This wasn't conditioning, it was evaluation. The light wasn't recruiting, it was cataloging. And Mason had passed a threshold where blind compliance no longer mattered. The silence lifted gradually. The forest resumed sound. His teammates remained oblivious. No missing time, no disruption. The light vanished without conclusion. That night, Mason understood the most dangerous truth of all. The phenomenon was learning, not about humanity, about individuals, about who could perceive without breaking, who could engage without surrendering, who could refuse without panic. Compatibility was rare. That explained the secrecy, the absence of mass sightings, the lack of catastrophic encounters. Whatever this intelligence was, it did not arrive dramatically. It filtered, and Mason had crossed from observer to reference point. Months later, a sealed file crossed his desk during a routine reassignment process. He wasn't meant to see it. The label alone was enough to stop his breath. Non-human signal interaction, low-frequency cases. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The truth was already clearer than any document could make it. This wasn't about UFOs landing or ghosts haunting trails. It was about a presence that intersected with reality selectively, interacting not with belief, but with capacity. And capacity was something the military understood better than anyone. Mason accepted the reassignment without comment. Different region, different terrain, same pattern. As he packed his gear, he felt the hum one last time, faint, distant, satisfied. Not a summons, a recognition. Whatever intelligence existed beyond the forest had not taken him. It had measured him and decided he was not a liability. That decision, more than any unanswered question, stayed with him, because it implied something far more unsettling than invasion or haunting. It implied judgment, and judgment requires criteria. The light wasn't asking whether humanity was ready. It was deciding who among them could remain intact after knowing it existed. And Mason knew, with a certainty that did not frighten him anymore, that the encounters were not over. They were simply spaced far enough apart to avoid detection, because the most advanced intelligence does not announce itself. It listens, it evaluates, and it waits. The reassignment order arrived without explanation. No justification beyond operational necessity, no discussion, no room for negotiation. Mason had learned enough by then to recognize the pattern. When reasons vanish from paperwork, it's usually because they exist somewhere else. The new location was colder, higher in elevation, and far less forgiving. Mountain terrain, sparse population, long stretches of land officially labeled as training corridors, but rarely used for anything routine, places where anomalies could occur without witnesses. On his first night, Mason didn't feel the hum immediately. That unsettled him more than its presence ever had. Silence, when expected, becomes a signal of its own. He lay awake in the barracks, eyes open, listening to the wind claw at the building. Snow tapped against metal siding in erratic bursts. The cold here was sharper, cleaner, less organic than the forest he'd left behind. At 02:47 his watch vibrated once, not an alarm, a notification, no message displayed, just vibration. He sat up slowly, heart steady, breath controlled. This wasn't fear anymore, it was anticipation tempered by caution. Whatever had been evaluating him before had not disengaged. It had merely changed method. Mason stepped outside, boots crunching softly in fresh snow. The compound was quiet, but not asleep. Security lights cast harsh cones across the yard. Cameras rotated on programmed arcs, and yet beyond the fence line, something interrupted the pattern. A distortion, not light. Absence of reflection. Where the snow should have shimmered faintly under moonlight, there was a patch that absorbed illumination entirely. No glare, no shine, just matte darkness shaped roughly like a vertical oval. The hum returned, subtle but unmistakable. This time, Mason felt it lower, closer to his center of gravity. His balance shifted involuntarily, as if the ground beneath him had tilted by fractions of a degree. He didn't approach immediately. He observed. The distortion didn't move. It didn't pulse. It didn't beckon. It simply existed, interrupting reality the way a dead pixel interrupts a screen. Mason glanced back at the compound. No alarms, no movement, no reaction. The systems didn't see it, or couldn't. That distinction mattered. He stepped forward. The distortion reacted, not by moving but by deepening. The absence intensified, pulling visual information inward. Snowflakes vanished as they passed through it, as if erased mid-fall. Mason stopped again. The pressure behind his eyes returned, stronger this time, accompanied by a sensation he hadn't felt before. Expectation, not anticipation. Expectation directed at him. His thoughts slowed, not foggy, but deliberate. Words lost urgency. Concepts aligned themselves without effort. He understood, without translation, that this was not a threshold meant to be crossed physically. It was a test of orientation. The distortion did not represent a doorway. It represented a reference point. Mason adjusted his stance, grounding himself deliberately. He did not step closer. He did not retreat. He held position. The hum stabilized. The pressure eased. The distortion remained for another 10 seconds, long enough to confirm the response, then collapsed inward without sound or light. Snow fell normally again. Moonlight returned. Mason exhaled slowly. This encounter was different. There had been no invitation, no movement, no time distortion, only assessment. The intelligence, whatever it was no longer exploring curiosity. It was refining criteria. Inside the barracks, Mason reviewed what he knew. The forest encounter, invitation and pursuit. The second meeting, calibration. The third signal, parallel observation. This one, boundary testing, a progression. He was no longer an unknown variable. He was a known quantity. That realization settled heavily, because being known meant being tracked, and tracking implies future interaction. Mason didn't report the distortion, not because he was hiding it, but because he understood reporting would be meaningless. Language failed here. There were no proper nouns for what he was experiencing. He lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling until morning. At dawn, nothing seemed altered. Snow melted where it should. Systems functioned. Personnel rotated. Normality resumed convincingly. Too convincingly. Mason began to see the pattern clearly now. The phenomenon didn't break reality. It used it. It operated in margins, in silence, in perception gaps, in moments where oversight relaxed just enough to allow evaluation without interference. This wasn't invasion. It was surveillance. Selective, discreet, patient. And Mason was no longer being evaluated alone. That afternoon, during a routine briefing, he noticed two other soldiers reacting subtly to something no one else acknowledged. A brief pause, a glance toward empty space. A micro-adjustment in posture. Recognition sparked instantly. Compatibility. The realization chilled him more than the mountain air ever could. He wasn't special. He was part of a small subset. People who could perceive the interference without destabilizing. That meant the phenomenon wasn't rare, only noticeable to few. As Mason left the briefing room, the hum returned briefly, so faint it could have been imagined. But he knew better now. It wasn't asking for attention. It was confirming network integrity. Whatever intelligence existed beyond the visible spectrum wasn't searching randomly. It was mapping human perception, node by node, quietly. And Mason had just realized he was no longer at the edge of the map. He was inside it. Mason began to test the silence, not recklessly, not openly, in small, controlled ways that would not register as deviation on any official report. He altered routines by minutes instead of hours. Changed walking paths within the compound, paused at thresholds, doors, stairwells, perimeter edges, and observed how the world responded when he hesitated where hesitation was not expected. Most of the time nothing happened. That, too, was data. But occasionally, rarely, he felt it. A faint resistance in the air, a subtle pressure behind the eyes, a momentary stillness that did not belong to the environment. The phenomenon was not constant. It was conditional. Mason began to suspect it responded not to location, but to state, not where he was, but how he oriented himself, internally, cognitively. On nights when his thoughts were scattered, the hum stayed away. When his mind was quiet, focused, aligned, it returned briefly as if acknowledging readiness. That realization disturbed him more than any light ever had. It meant whatever was observing him did not require proximity. It required coherence. During a late patrol along the outer fence line, Mason felt the clearest signal since the forest. No visual anomaly this time, no distortion, just the hum, deep, steady, unmistakable. He stopped walking. The hum intensified. He shifted his focus deliberately, grounding himself in physical sensation, breath, posture, balance. The hum stabilized, confirmation. Whatever this intelligence was, it interacted not with fear or curiosity, but with regulation. With nervous systems capable of maintaining equilibrium under anomaly. That explained why so few noticed. Most people react too loudly, internally. Mason did not, at least not anymore. Weeks passed without further overt encounters, but Mason noticed something else emerging quietly around him. Patterns in people. Certain soldiers exhibited the same subtle markers he now recognized in himself. Slight delays in reaction to sudden stimuli, not from slowness, but from processing depth. Eyes that tracked empty space a moment longer than necessary, calm under disorientation. None of them spoke about it, none of them needed to. Recognition didn't require language. One night, while reviewing maintenance logs in a dim operations room, Mason noticed a file header he had never seen before. It appeared briefly on a shared terminal before disappearing as if never accessed. The words burned into his memory instantly. Perceptual Stability Assessment, Tier 4. He didn't click it. He didn't need to. The existence of the file was the message. The military wasn't hunting UFOs. It wasn't cataloging ghosts. It was identifying people. People who could remain intact when reality flexed. People who could experience anomaly without collapsing into fear, obsession, or denial. Mason realized then that the light on the trail had not been the first contact. It had been the first external confirmation. The infrastructure had been there long before. The intelligence, human or otherwise, was not trying to reveal itself. It was filtering, selecting, ensuring continuity of observation without destabilization. That night, Mason dreamed again, not of lights or forests, but of layered grids overlaying familiar terrain, invisible structures intersecting physical space at angles that made sense only when perceived as process rather than geometry. He woke with the certainty that the phenomenon was not singular. It was systemic. And systems require maintenance. The next encounter came without spectacle. During a snowstorm, visibility near zero, Mason felt the hum intensify sharply. The world narrowed to breadth and balance. Snow erased depth. Direction lost meaning. For a brief moment, he could not tell whether he was moving forward or standing still. Then clarity returned, not visually, but internally. Orientation reasserted itself. Mason adjusted his stance and waited. The hum receded. Later, he realized something important. The phenomenon did not correct mistakes. It observed responses. It was not guiding him toward answers. It was watching how he stabilized himself when answers were unavailable. That was the criterion. As Mason returned to the barracks, a thought surfaced unbidden. This isn't about discovery. It's about resilience. Whatever intelligence existed beyond human perception did not need to announce itself. It needed assurance that interaction would not cause collapse. Mason understood now why there were no mass sightings, why encounters were fragmented, contradictory, easily dismissed. The phenomenon did not scale to crowds, it scaled to capacity, and capacity, once exceeded, produced noise. Noise was dangerous. As Mason lay down, the hum returned one last time, faint, steady, neutral, not approval, not warning, presence. And for the first time since the trail at 3 a.m., Mason felt something unexpected. Not fear, not awe, responsibility. Because being able to perceive something does not grant ownership over it. It grants obligation. The obligation to remain stable, to remain quiet, to remain human in the presence of something that does not need belief to exist. And Mason suspected, deeply, unsettlingly, that this obligation was not unique to him. Others were being prepared, slowly, selectively. Silently, and when the moment came, whatever that moment was, the world would not change all at once. Only those capable of noticing would feel the shift. Everyone else would call it coincidence, or imagination, or nothing at all. And the system, whatever it truly was, would continue operating undisturbed, because the most advanced intelligence does not conquer, it integrates, and integration requires patience, which it clearly had. Mason's final reassignment placed him somewhere the map still pretended did not exist. No town nearby, no marked access roads, no civilian air traffic overhead. The kind of location chosen not because something was happening there, but because if something did happen, it would remain contained. The facility itself was unremarkable by design. Low-profile buildings, neutral colors, no visible antennas or towers. Everything important was either underground or folded into the landscape so cleanly it looked accidental. This was not a listening post, it was a buffer. Mason understood that immediately. Whatever process had been unfolding around him for months had reached a phase where observation alone was no longer sufficient. Stability had been verified, compatibility confirmed. Now the system, human or otherwise, required something different: proximity. On his first night, Mason did not feel the hum. That absence was deliberate. Silence, when intentional, carries more meaning than presence ever could. He stood outside under a sky stripped of light pollution, stars sharp and indifferent. The cold was precise here, cutting cleanly through layers of clothing. It sharpened thought, slowed impulse. At exactly 02:58, Mason felt a shift. Not inside himself, but in the environment. Not sound, not pressure, orientation. The sense of here adjusted. The ground beneath his boots felt subtly reinforced, as if reality had braced itself. The horizon flattened unnaturally, depth compressing without visual distortion. This was not an encounter. It was preparation. Mason remained still. At 03:05 the light did not appear. Instead, something else occurred. The stars dimmed, not disappearing, not moving, but losing intensity, as if viewed through a layer that had not existed a moment before. The sky felt closer, contained. Then the hum arrived, not beneath the world, but through it. Not vibration, resonance. Mason's breathing synchronized automatically. His thoughts slowed, not from intrusion, but from coherence. Mental noise fell away, leaving only structure. This was different from the forest, different from the mountain. There was no invitation here, no guidance, no test. This was alignment at scale. The realization struck with unsettling clarity. The phenomenon was no longer evaluating individuals. It was evaluating interfaces, and Mason was standing inside one. The air in front of him thickened, not visually but spatially. Distance lost relevance. A step forward no longer meant movement toward anything. It meant movement within a condition. Mason did not step. He waited. That restraint mattered. The hum deepened, then stabilized at a frequency that felt permanent, like a baseline reality had always had, but humans rarely noticed. Images surfaced, not imposed, not intrusive. Conceptual impressions, layers, thresholds, zones of interaction governed by tolerance, not permission. This was not contact, this was architecture. Mason understood then why the phenomenon avoided crowds, why encounters were fragmented, why belief had never mattered. The system did not want attention, it required compatibility. Compatibility was rare not because humans lacked intelligence, but because most nervous systems collapsed under ambiguity. Fear, obsession, denial, all destabilizing forces. What Mason was experiencing now required none of those. It required quiet continuity. The stars brightened again, the sky released its hold, the hum receded, not vanishing, but settling deeper, like something embedded rather than imposed. Time resumed its ordinary texture. Mason checked his watch. 03:02. 4 minutes had passed. They felt appropriate. Inside the facility, nothing had changed. No alarms, no reports. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. That was the confirmation. This location was not for observation, it was for coexistence. Over the following weeks, Mason noticed subtle environmental anomalies that others dismissed without thought. Equipment calibrated slightly off baseline, but always within acceptable margins. Weather patterns that behaved correctly but inefficiently. Data that aligned functionally but resisted modeling. Noise at the edges of precision. The system, whatever it was not disruptive. It was parasitic in the most neutral sense, integrated. The realization carried weight. This was not a phenomenon waiting to reveal itself. It had already integrated long ago. The lights, the silence, the lost time, those were not invasions, they were diagnostic tools, and Mason had passed through every phase without fracturing. That night, as he lay awake, Mason understood the final truth of the trail at 3 a.m. The question had never been whether it was a UFO or a ghost. Those were human containers for fear. The real question was simpler and far more unsettling. How long has this system been here? And more importantly, how many people have interacted with it without ever realizing they were part of the process? The hum did not return. It didn't need to. Mason had reached a point where absence itself carried meaning, and meaning, once recognized, cannot be unseen. Mason's final reassignment placed him somewhere the map still pretended did not exist. No town nearby, no marked access roads, no civilian air traffic overhead. The kind of location chosen not because something was happening there, but because if something did happen, it would remain contained. The facility itself was unremarkable by design. Low-profile buildings, neutral colors, no visible antennas or towers. Everything important was either underground or folded into the landscape so cleanly it looked accidental. This was not a listening post. It was a buffer. Mason understood that immediately. Whatever process had been unfolding around him for months had reached a phase where observation alone was no longer sufficient. Stability had been verified. Compatibility confirmed. Now the system, human or otherwise, required something different: proximity. On his first night, Mason did not feel the hum. That absence was deliberate. Silence, when intentional, carries more meaning than presence ever could. He stood outside under a sky stripped of light pollution, stars sharp and indifferent. The cold was precise here, cutting cleanly through layers of clothing. It sharpened thought, slowed impulse. At exactly 2:58, Mason felt a shift, not inside himself, but in the environment. Not sound, not pressure, orientation. The sense of here adjusted. The ground beneath his boots felt subtly reinforced, as if reality had braced itself. The horizon flattened unnaturally, depth compressing without visual distortion. This was not an encounter. It was preparation. Mason remained still. At 03 hours the light did not appear. Instead, something else occurred. The stars dimmed, not disappearing, not moving, but losing intensity as if viewed through a layer that had not existed a moment before. The sky felt closer, contained. Then the hum arrived, not beneath the world, but through it. Not vibration, resonance. Mason's breathing synchronized automatically. His thoughts slowed, not from intrusion, but from coherence. Mental noise fell away, leaving only structure. This was different from the forest, different from the mountain. There was no invitation here, no guidance, no test. This was alignment at scale. The realization struck with unsettling clarity. The phenomenon was no longer evaluating individuals. It was evaluating interfaces, and Mason was standing inside one. The air in front of him thickened, not visually but spatially. Distance lost relevance. A step forward no longer meant movement toward anything, it meant movement within a condition. Mason did not step. He waited. That restraint mattered. The hum deepened, then stabilized at a frequency that felt permanent, like a baseline reality had always had, but humans rarely noticed. Images surfaced, not imposed, not intrusive. Conceptual impressions, layers, thresholds, zones of interaction governed by tolerance, not permission. This was not contact. This was architecture. Mason understood then why the phenomenon avoided crowds, why encounters were fragmented, why belief had never mattered. The system did not want attention, it required compatibility. Compatibility was rare not because humans lacked intelligence, but because most nervous systems collapsed under ambiguity. Fear, obsession, denial, all destabilizing forces. What Mason was experiencing now required none of those. It required quiet continuity. The stars brightened again. The sky released its hold. The hum receded, not vanishing, but settling deeper, like something embedded rather than imposed. Time resumed its ordinary texture. Mason checked his watch. 03:02. 4 minutes had passed. They felt appropriate. Inside the facility, nothing had changed. No alarms, no reports. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. That was the confirmation. This location was not for observation. It was for coexistence. Over the following weeks, Mason noticed subtle environmental anomalies that others dismissed without thought. Equipment calibrated slightly off baseline, but always within acceptable margins. Weather patterns that behaved correctly but inefficiently. Data that aligned functionally but resisted modeling. Noise at the edges of precision. The system, whatever it was not disruptive. It was parasitic in the most neutral sense. Integrated. The realization carried weight. This was not a phenomenon waiting to reveal itself. It had already integrated long ago. The lights, the silence, the lost time, those were not invasions, they were diagnostic tools, and Mason had passed through every phase without fracturing. That night, as he lay awake, Mason understood the final truth of the trail at 3 a.m. The question had never been whether it was a UFO or a ghost. Those were human containers for fear. The real question was simpler and far more unsettling. How long has this system been here? And more importantly, how many people have interacted with it without ever realizing they were part of the process? The hum did not return. It didn't need to. Mason had reached a point where absence itself carried meaning, and meaning, once recognized, cannot be unseen. For years, people asked the wrong question about that night on the trail. They asked whether the light was a UFO, whether it was a ghost, whether Mason had imagined it under stress. Those questions were comforting because they were familiar. They fit inside categories people already knew how to dismiss. What Mason learned was far more unsettling. Nothing had appeared for him. Nothing had come to him. He had simply crossed into a moment where perception and stability were tested, and he did not break. The light was not a message. The silence was not a warning. The lost time was not a mistake. They were measurements. This was never about invasion, disclosure, or contact in the way people expect. There were no demands, no revelations, no truths meant for crowds. There was only a system that operated quietly, patiently, and selectively, interacting only where interaction would not cause damage. Most people would never notice it. Some would notice and panic. A very small number would notice and remain intact. Those were the ones that mattered. Mason did not become special because of what he saw. He became relevant because of how he held what he experienced. He didn't chase answers. He didn't demand meaning. He stayed stable in the presence of uncertainty, and that, more than belief or disbelief, was the threshold. The most frightening part of this story is not that something unknown exists beyond human perception. It's that it has likely always been there, quietly adjusting, correcting, maintaining balance, while humanity argued about what it wanted to see. The trail at 3 a.m. was not the beginning of contact. It was a routine check. And Mason's life returned to normal, not because nothing happened, but because everything that needed to happen already had. The world didn't change that night. It simply confirmed who could exist within it without tearing it apart. And that confirmation, once made, required no further attention at all.